With Final Fantasy XVI finally releasing on Xbox Series X, I thought it was high time I sat down to record my review of Final Fantasy XVI. With a budget of $300 million, a 10-year development cycle, a studio that understood the fundamentals of Final Fantasy, and a legacy spanning nearly 4 decades, Final Fantasy XVI had all the promise to become the next great entry in the series and usher Square Enix into the 9th console generation. The original Final Fantasy not only saved a fledgling Square from bankruptcy, but it also birthed the golden age of JRPGs, which would arguably reach its crescendo with Final Fantasy VII, only to lie dormant until the likes of Persona 5 single-handedly revitalized the genre, something that continues to this day with no signs of slowing down. Despite all the positives that Final Fantasy XVI had in its corner, and against all odds, 16 still managed to fumble what was perhaps the easiest 6 in the company's history. It's not just its confusing collage of a narrative that could have and should have focused on just one of its cliched and tired plot threads, or its lack of character development, nor its atrocious environmental design that's completely devoid of any semblance of rewarding exploration, or even, sadly, its forgettable soundtrack. And while it's certainly all of these things, Final Fantasy XVI's obnoxious tone and decrepit one-dimensional combat decimated any hope 16 had of holding the torch for one of the industry's former titans. Let's just take a moment with one another to be perfectly frank. I don't think Final Fantasy XVI is an entirely terrible game. In fact, beneath its shiny veneer and discount Soulsborne/Devil May Cry combat model, there is a relatively okay game, just not one titled Final Fantasy, and certainly not one that cost over $250 million to develop. Previous numbered entries generally did a pretty good job of balancing that fine line between overly dramatic and comical when it came to the structure of its narrative. The series never treated its audience as children, particularly when it came to tackling serious subject matters like genocide. More importantly, the player was always left with a sense of hope. We wanted to keep pushing against the rising tide because we saw what life was like for the characters should they succeed. 16 does the complete opposite, wrapping its narrative in a tone that's so overly oppressive and depressive that it becomes annoying and tiresome. By hour 35, I was still being told how horrible the world of Valencia is, and by that point, I just didn't give a shit. In fact, a large part of me wanted the antagonist to win. I wanted Ultima to Aizen Sosuke everyone just so I didn't have to hear how bad this world was anymore. I can even tell you the exact moment when I threw up my hands and cried out, for fuck's sake. Around hour 35 or so, our band of characters enter a pub. A cutscene plays and the camera swoops in on a grimy old table where we overhear a woman casually bragging about giving up her newborn baby because it could produce water from its hands. By this point, we'd seen magic users treated as slaves and forced to use their powers until they turned to stone. We'd seen child abuse, beheld the aftermath of war, and witnessed the terrible life for the lowest members of society. We'd even seen a fucking chocobo squashed by a boulder, one of the happiest, cutest creatures in fiction, reduced to a bloody pile of gore, and yet, by the third act, we were still being told about how bad everything is. 16 was so worried we just didn't get it that it felt the need to hammer one final nail in the coffin. If we're being completely honest with one another, having a heavy-handed approach to the tone of your story, even when paired with a sloppy narrative, can all too often be forgiven if the combat system is engaging and provides the player with that satisfying feedback loop that can help you switch off those parts of your brain that will hyper-focus on the smaller details. It almost pains me to say that 16's combat system is fundamentally broken. I'm not saying it's broken because you can craft a build that steamrolls through enemies. That would actually be fun, but rather it's the framework of the combat system broken from the moment of its inception. 16 lacks the bare basic understanding of an action RPG Soulsborne combat model that it's almost laughable. The combat is so stale and so boring that I really do wonder who is making the decisions at Square. I'm not saying switching genres isn't impossible, far from it. Yakuza Like a Dragon seamlessly adapted a traditional turn-based JRPG combat system into the long-running Yakuza franchise, because the team at Ryuga Toko Studio understood how to craft a satisfying combat system that stayed true to the genre principles while incorporating what made a Yakuza game a Yakuza game. Not so much for Final Fantasy XVI, whose encounters lack any substance and have no depth, with combat swiftly becoming boring. In Final Fantasy XVI, the combat system is built around one core element, the stagger bar. I know, right? Most lower level fodder have no stagger bar at all, but most minor and major bosses require you to break it 2 to 4 times before you can claim victory. Although you can do some damage to your opponent's health bar without breaking the stamina meter, the damage is so minuscule that it should never be your main focus. For 16, the series staple summon system has been done away with and usurped by the dominant mechanic, with 6 of the previous summons acting as our main form of attack. Clive, our protagonist, can choose from 5 abilities from each icon, 1 ultimate, 3 normal, and 1 light attack. We expend XP points to level these up, and once maxed out, they can be swapped in and out with whichever is our main icon. Because we're forced to focus on depleting an enemy's stamina bar before we can begin to inflict true damage, we therefore have no choice but to prioritize stagger damaging icon moves. Naturally, we then need to choose attacks that deal the most damage so we can really take a chunk out of our enemy's health bar before the stamina gauge replenishes. After that, it's AoE control because you'll be dealing with mobs. Lots of mobs, especially when encountering many of the game's mini and major bosses. So, by design, Final Fantasy XVI forces the player into one specific playstyle. Once you settle on a particular roster of attacks, there is absolutely no reason for you to experiment or alter which icon abilities you use. For me, this came after obtaining Bahamut's abilities. Using Giga Flare as my ultimate combined with Clive's half-dominant transformation, think Dante's Devil Trigger but not nearly as fun, Clive's transformation increases the damage output of our attacks, so naturally, popping your ultimate in this mode is the most efficient way of inflicting the maximum amount of health damage. And just like that, by its very blueprint, combat was utterly ruined. Encounters became a battle of attrition. If you can last long enough, you would win. Worse still, Clive is stuck with the same weapon type from hour 1 to hour 50. I'd hoped with each win over a dominant, Clive would get access to a unique weapon, Odin's Katana or the Fists of Titan. This easily would have provided a new fun layer to combat, changing the way Clive feels and plays. In a perfect world, depending on the weapon Clive had equipped, it would also increase or alter certain icon abilities. But alas, we live in this timeline, where AA studios with a 5th of the workforce and a 10th of the budget can produce experiences that far outshine anything Square Enix has published recently, with an exception here or there. Final Fantasy has always presented a combat system that was easy to learn, but tough to master, but it was never not engaging. Some fights would require you to have specific party members or builds, or you'll face an incredible challenge, if not instant death. Other fights ask the player to think outside the box, like throwing a phoenix down on the final boss of the game to kill it instantly. By design, 16 needs every fight to be winnable with every possible combination of abilities, and because we do little to no damage with our sword, allowing the player to fall back on their weapon should they choose a less optimal build wasn't possible. 16 doesn't want you to think. It doesn't want the audience to feel weak, but the very audience they hope to capture are playing games that require thought and attention. You know, like previous Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy XVI suffers from a complete lack of commitment to its newfound ARPG home, with no option to customize Clive's loadout to allow players experimentation and absolutely zero meaningful crafting options. In fact, half the crafting system is locked behind a New Game Plus run. Then there's the lack of any real build progression to push the player to explore a little bit more, to fight one more fight. There's no real reason to fight any of the optional enemies, as critical path bosses will always drop the best weapon for that stage of the game. You can also forget about the ultimate weapon, since you'll need to start a 3rd run just to use it. That's right, the ultimate weapon only becomes available at the end of your 2nd run. Final Fantasy VII allowed players to craft the ultimate weapon before fighting the final boss. The only real bright moments that seep through the grim mire of combat encounters are the kaiju battles. In these scripted moments scattered throughout Final Fantasy XVI, Clive will embody the full power of his Eikon Ifrit and fight the other dominants in encounters that can only be described as bombastic. Unfortunately, as grandiose as these battles are, they're still just a battle of attrition. You will eventually win as long as you keep chipping away at your opponent's stagger bar and health bar. One battle in particular actually pushed me to my limit, not because of its difficulty or its mechanics, but because it just didn't know when to fucking stop. This fight went on for nearly 35 minutes. Now, Final Fantasy isn't a stranger to long fights. User Mat from Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age can last anywhere from 1 to 8 hours, but that fight requires your undivided attention, appropriate party composition, and character setup, combined with boss mechanics that force you to think. Speaking of party composition, 16 has none of it. There's zero control when it comes to choosing which characters make up your party. Not that it matters because you have zero control over their actions anyway, except for our dog Torgal, who keeps up our combo meter, which does something, and occasionally heals us. I could almost forgive the state of 16's combat model, or at least tolerate it, if we could create some interesting synergies between characters. Imagine that perfect world scenario once again. This time, we get to choose our party members, or not. Either way, they're more than just garden ornaments. What we can do, though, is create some amazing combo moves. Fire and ice between Ifrit and Shiva, or a volcanic combo between Rahumat and Ifrit, or a heaven and hell attack between Phoenix and Ifrit. Just think about the possibilities. It would have added a new over-the-top edge to the stale, boring combat model. 16's elements are far more extensive than the shallow combat model and overbearing tone. The messy and quite frankly boring narrative could be forgiven if these active systems were engaging. The lack of characterization and character growth could be brushed aside if we believed in the character's cause and wanted to see their resolution rewarded. Unfortunately, neither a better combat system or subdued tone would help with the lack of rewarding gameplay. Something that carries over into a New Game Plus run, by the way. 3 hours into a New Game Plus run and chess still rewarded 10 gil. Never mind the 300,000 I had sitting in my inventory because the only thing left for me to spend it on were tracks that play while you're in camp. There's just so much more I could discuss, the poorly thought out active lore mechanic or the completely useless badge system, but I don't want to turn this review into a purely burn the witch scenario, so let's take a moment to highlight the few positives, because there are some. 16's visual fidelity and presentation really are spectacular. How my TV didn't fry with the sheer vastness of particle effects flying around during combat is anybody's guess. The voice acting is superb, and some of the characters actually did have a compelling arc. Well, one did, Jill, who happened to be my favorite and really should have been my main character. But 16's refusal to completely let go of its JRPG roots and fully embrace an action combat / Soulsborne / Devil May Cry combat system really had me wishing I could take back those 50 hours. The very worst thing about all of this is that Square had the perfect template at hand to bring a new Final Fantasy story to life, and that was the hybrid system from the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, which managed the impossible by catering to turn-based RPG fans and action combat fans alike. Why Square chose not to utilize this framework is such a missed opportunity that it really should be made criminal. I'm fully aware of how negative this review sounds, so much so that this is in fact the 6th edition of this script, and yet, with each new iteration, my thoughts just kept creeping back to just how disappointing 16 is. And yeah, the development studio has some incredibly talented individuals weaving their magic behind the scenes, but 16 is nonetheless a death by 1,000 cuts. Final Fantasy 16 reeks of desperation. A publishing studio with one of the biggest and most recognizable IPs in the industry that seems almost embarrassed by its history, that it feels the need to cast the widest possible net in hopes of capturing the largest possible audience at the cost of systematic brand dilution and an unshakable belief that turn-based JRPGs are a thing of the past, and the only experience that gamers want are a fast-paced action RPG. Meanwhile, This is the same timeline, the same dimension as Persona 5, Honkai Star Rail, and more recently, Clair Obscure Expedition 33. So I guess, do I recommend Final Fantasy 16? Absolutely not. Even on special and with the DLC, 16 is a complete waste of time, and with so many other fantastic experiences out there begging to be played, especially from the indie and AA space, go support them instead, not a company throwing 300 million USD into the ether.